thanks for coming to probably the rogue presentation here at Spring One, because this is about prototyping mobile. There's not a whole lot of mobile here, and there's about 30 to 40 mobile folks here. So how many people here, you can go ahead and roll to the agenda slide. How many people here have written mobile apps? And please raise your hand when I ask you, like most of you did, because if you look bored, then I'm going to get bored, and I don't want to be bored at my own talk. So please go ahead and speak up. And during the, we're going to do really, you can distill this down into really 2 agenda items. I'm going to do an overall intro, kind of a broad industry view of mobile prototyping, and then Anne's going to pick it up, and she'll have the bulk of the time focusing on leveraging Spring Boot for mobile prototyping. The mobile prototyping stuff, you can go ahead and roll. So this is just some of the stuff I did. Most of it is, yeah, we got this goofy transition here. A lot of the stuff I did was really all mobile centered. I worked at, this is why I'm wearing this, I worked at Citibank for 10 years. I worked at Bank of America for 17 years, and I could not do a talk without wearing a suit coat. So this is just the banking infestation that I have inside of me. So I did a lot of work on mobile. I started working on Spring really only 2 years ago. So from 1999, when I started writing Palm applications on the train ride, I'm from Chicago. I've been involved in mobile, and I still work on mobile today, but I spend a significant amount of time with Spring as well. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to give you guys just a brief overview of, and this includes Anne, our hands-on experience with mobile prototyping. And it wasn't academic. It resulted in things that went to production that are still used today by millions and millions of users on their phones, doing real things, moving money around. That's my career has always been connected with money moving, and if you think you got demanding users, when there's a problem with their money, their true colors come out, and they're not happy when people are messing with their money. So I started working on Palm in 1999, rolled into getting a little application. I don't know if you guys remember something that used to be called Blackberries. Yeah, not too many of them around anymore. They're probably going to get a little more prevalent when they start supporting Android, which is going to happen in the coming months ahead. Rolled out BlackBerry. Then I got challenged in 2004 to come up with a way to do secure mobile banking on handsets. So 2004, I can't remember who was president in 2004, but it's way pre-iPhone, pre-Android. Lots, we kind of have a duopoly now. At that time, there was just a lot of feature phones, and it was like, how do we guarantee the security of these devices, both for the data at rest and data in motion? So it was a significant problem. We came up with a solution, rolled it out, went from 0 to over 1 million in 1 year. Came up with something called W Mobile that Anne's going to mention later on. Then came, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, then came the iPhone. And this is 2007, and nobody really, at least where I was working, the Bank of America is a fantastic company. So it wasn't just that they weren't super interested. There was a lot of people who weren't interested. I actually had to go to Woodfield Mall in Schaumburg, and I was taking pictures of the iPhone with Bank of America mobile banking on it, because we could not get a phone from Apple till it was launched to everybody. And the business people were like, oh, we'll just tell them that we're Bank of America. They'll give us a phone early. And I'm like, yeah, I knew what Apple was like. They were like, so what, you're Bank of America. We don't care. We're not giving you a phone. So I was taking pictures of the phone in the Apple store with the Apple store guy kind of like, what are you doing there? And sending pictures to the business. That's how we did the testing for it, because that was our only choice. The big epiphany where I got so bloody excited about mobile prototyping, mobile app development was at the little theater, which I don't know if the live event was at that little theater or not. It probably was, where they released the Apple SDK February 2008, and I got to be there, and that's when I got really bit by the mobile bug. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. So how many of you guys develop on like 3 or more languages? How about keep your hands up, 4 or more languages? All right. How about 5? Oh, these 2 guys in the front, man. Okay. If you don't mind sharing, what are they? Scala, Groovy, Java. Objective-C, all right, okay. And you?
Pretty much the same. Yeah.
Right.
Even back WAP.
Okay, WAP, okay. We have to get a beer later, yeah, we lived on that. So you dealt with, okay. You know, we're talking about WAP, that's one of the things where things are easier today, because there was something called the WAP gap in the mid-2000s where people would open up an SSL connection. They would think it's end-to-end secure, but it would go to the carrier gateway. They would decrypt it and then re-encrypt it. And we had to detect all those connections. So we had to actually talk to carriers, talk to them about what gateway they have. And we would actually turn off, in the case of, we'd turn off T-Mobile for BlackBerry platform because they had the WAP gap. Other phones, they routed through different gateways. So in many ways, things are much simpler. That's great to hear that you lived through some of that stuff. So, how about tools? I was going to ask, how many people don't even know how many tools they use? I mean, we all use so many different tools. So these are complications for anybody doing development. When you move into the mobile space, as some of you know, it's like all that and then with speed, you know, just so intense. The deception is that in security you got this thing called detectability. The problem is you can be under the illusion that it's actually not complicated, because you can't tell how complicated, or you're so naive that you don't understand how complicated it is. And I threw some examples up here. Location-based services, push notification. How many people have done a push notification application? How many have done it for millions of users? So what's one of the things you got to be concerned about if you're pushing to millions of users? I don't mean to put you on the spot. So one of the things, and this is probably handled by your implementation, but one of the things that you can get burned by is Apple you can fire off a push to Apple, and they'll probably send it fine. But if you start pushing to the level where they feel like you're spamming the user, they will turn off your ability to do push notifications. So you need to be responsive to the feedback that they give you and throttle your push notifications. So that's something you know, to be aware of. Expectations. So it used to be, when we initially rolled things out, used to be people would go, oh my gosh, I can see my balance on my phone. I can see what my checking account balance is. I can't believe it. Now, I live in Chicago. You can be on the underground L train, and if people can't get to their account to move money, they get irritated. So expectations have gone way up. Andy Glover talked last night about the need for rapid change, or responsiveness to rapid change. So I think he spoke very, very well to that. Used to be you could do a release once or twice a year. Now you need to be doing a release typically once a quarter, if not more. We talked a little bit about security, privacy concerns, talking about location-based services. Biggest challenge we had on location-based services weren't so much the technical ones, it was working with the legal department. People are very sensitive to people tracking their location. They pay attention, or at least they should pay attention to the permissions they're giving to an application. So there needs to be a good reason if you're tracking people's location. They have to recognize that it's a value add for them. And then lastly, reputational risk. And you can really tie together the expectations, legal and reputational risk. If you're doing work for a big company, you really do not want to screw up. Certain things like photos that probably shouldn't have been taken. If the user actually deletes them, they should really, really be gone. Come on, you guys. You guys don't. You guys need a cup of coffee more than I do. So we talked about that generally software engineering is complicated. And what I'm trying to assert to you guys with some gray hairs on my head and have done this for 15 years that mobile is even more complicated. And if you don't think it is, stick around. We can talk some more after the show. But you probably think it is because there's a lot of talks you could have gone to and you chose to come to this one. So you need a place. You need a safe place. We all need a safe place. You need a safe place to try things out, because this is a lot different than this is actually an awesome HTC One M8, which is a great phone, and it had NFC before iPhone 6. So how about that? It's something that people take with them. There's few things that are more personal to people than their cell phones. People will sometimes leave their house without bringing their keys, but they usually remember their cell phone. So it's something that has a contextual aspect in addition to just a screen and a keyboard. And all those different things I talked about, location, push alerts, there's a lot of things that are unique to the form factor of the phone. So it's not just learning how to do alerts. It's learning how to connect geofencing with alerts, with a fast UI, with access to backends. It's like a whole bunch of tinker toys that you want to try together. I really do an analogy. You can go to the next slide. Analogy like a painting, and all these different capabilities that the mobile device has are tools on a canvas, but you need a canvas to draw this on. And so what we did, and I hope it's okay to say this, don't get me in trouble, but this is getting recorded too, right? So we used the Amazon cloud to prototype a lot of the features that we wanted to move into production. The top is the typical, desktop browser-based guys who basically they could work on the intranet, pretty much do everything they needed to do. But we were doing all these things with location. I remember driving around with the keyboard on the chair and doing geofencing testing in my car. And I couldn't do that connecting to all this backend. So we mimicked a lot of the operational functionality in the Amazon cloud and then get all the concepts working, did them completely anonymously, and then move them into the formal stack. So that was our canvas. We could work extremely fast in that model, and without having that capability, I think it would have taken some of the stuff we did in 6 weeks. Probably could have taken a year if we didn't have that kind of environment. And this is in the 2000s. We can go to the next slide. So, on the client side, use tools like iOS SDK. There's a lot of different options, and I'll just touch on these briefly. So, typically, you can think of it as a big decision tree where you decide, am I going to do web-based or am I going to do native, right? You guys have probably had conversations about this. What do you do? Typically, responsive web if it's web-based. Then you go, well, you know what? I just don't think the browser is going to do it for us. Or ideally, you probably, in some cases, and this is what we did a mix of browser to hit the masses and then sharpshooting some functionality with native. But then you go native, and then you got to decide between cross-platform tooling, things like PhoneGap, Titanium, Row Mobile, and there's others. And you guys know what these are? These are things where you basically use web artifacts, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then it generates all these different binaries for you. You guys are with me, right? I don't know if you know what I'm talking about or you don't care, but I'll keep going. The other choice is MEEPs. Does anybody know what MEEPs are? So MEEPs, so this is the other choice between cross-platform tooling and MEEPs. MEEPs are mobile enterprise application platforms. So this is everything that those Write Once Anywhere tools are, or claim to be Write Once Run Anywhere tools. And then also you get server-side infrastructure as well. So these also do like the application management, application deployment. This is like a big commitment to go into the MEEP world. It probably lasts longer than many marriages. So take it at least as seriously as a marriage. Huge investment. A friend of mine works for a company. She just joined this big insurance company. We worked together for many years. And she's like, you know, they're spending like $2 million on this infrastructure. And they have one application on it. So big companies sometimes make crazy decisions. So remember, if you remember one thing, or if you don't like the idea of buying all this big infrastructure, if you think it might be better, and I personally feel it's much better to invest in your people and just use the native SDKs, because the Write Once Run Anywhere tools, you're buying into proprietary framework, often long-term contracts, very complicated. There's things called the Gartner Rule of 3. So don't go from native over to these MEEPs without first making sure you got at least 3 applications on 3 different mobile platforms, which today is a little tough to do because there's such a duopoly between Android and Apple, and then hitting 3 different backends. And I personally think even with that, I'd really think twice, because there's a lot you can do to get the same kind of cross-platform by doing hybrid development. Hybrid development is taking like Objective-C, wrapping a UI web view, doing your user interface as a browser, but then you have a wrapper around so you can still get the alerting, still do some of the deeper fine-grained controls on location-based services, things of that nature. So I think that gives you the best of both worlds, and you're not buying into any vendor framework. You're not getting the delay that a lot of these guys get on where a new feature is released. You got to wait for them to implement it. I don't have that kind of patience. I think the last thing. Oh, and we used LAMP on the server side, and if it wasn't for Spring Boot, which Ann is just going to jump into in a moment, the new one's called, like, you heard that mean is the new LAMP, right? Yeah. So MongoDB, Express, Angular, Node.js. So that would be if I was doing this now and Spring Boot wasn't around, I would use mean instead of LAMP. I can't believe that LAMP is like old now, but so I think. So the last thing I wanted to say is just really take mobile software engineering really seriously, because in many ways it's so easy now. It's like 8-year-olds playing with a machine gun. You know, it's a lot you can do, but it doesn't mean you necessarily should do it. So with that, we're going to transition now to more of a Spring Boot focus. So turning it over to Ann. Ann Fick and I have only worked together since 1996.
Thanks, Pete. Can you hear me? Good. All right, so Pete talked a little bit about the challenges in doing prototypes, and we were doing a lot of prototypes. And so about 2 years ago, when we started looking at Spring, we'd come across different projects and different things about mobile, and we thought, well, geez, is this something we can use to help us in our mobile prototyping? A little bit about me. I've been programming for a long time, most recently on mobile and server-side Java with Pete. And I'm also a platform tennis enthusiast, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I wanted to see how Spring can be leveraged to address the challenges that we faced in mobile prototyping. The advantages are that we could use the same language that we normally program in, the same tools, so everything's familiar. Now you have an easier chance of reusing things when you move to production. It's not all throwaway code. And also, often you can more accurately simulate what you're trying to do. So that was our hypothesis. You can go to the next slide. All right. So we looked at Pete's slide earlier with the cloud and with the mobile device. And now what we're adding in on the client side, we're going to look at the Spring Mobile and Spring Android. And on the server side, we'll look at the Spring framework, specifically the REST controller and the Spring Boot. All right, so challenge one that Pete was showing earlier was that to test mobile devices, to do prototyping, you need internet accessible services. And that's more of a challenge if you're in a big enterprise. The advent of cloud has made that pretty easy to set up our playground, right? We have a playground, now we can write RESTful services that we can talk to, we can mimic various things. But you still have to maintain your environment. You have multiple tools and things that you're running out on the cloud. And so we looked at Spring Boot as a way, since it allows this easy configuration and deployment, we looked to see if that would help us. The challenge two was on the server side, you need to develop the web services pretty quickly. You don't want to be spending time on this prototype. So currently we had the LAMP implementation, and that was pretty quick to develop in. Mostly we did PHP scripting, but it was all throwaway code at the end. With the Spring framework, now we can code in Java, and we can use the REST controller to help with the rapid development. We're going to see that in a minute. Finally, the challenge three was to rapidly prototype things on the client side. And so currently we use native tools like the Android and iOS development kits. We wanted to see if Spring for Android could help speed this up. So we picked a use case that we thought was fairly simple and also that we could have a little fun with. As I said before, I like to play platform tennis. If you live in Chicago during the winter, it's a sport that you can play outside. I play recreationally, and I volunteer for a lot of tournaments. What is paddle, you may ask, because many people don't know. It was invented in 1928 in the East, played mostly outside in the winter. It's played on a raised platform, kind of like this. And the platform is heated so that the elements such as rain and snow are dried and aren't on the court. So you can play pretty much night or day in almost all conditions except for lightning. The court's much like tennis. It's about a third of the size. The rules are pretty much the same as tennis. And there's screens that surround the court, and they're playable as they often are in racquetball and squash with the walls, which makes it more of an interesting game as well. So here's a picture of a platform tennis court. This was in January at the Illinois States tournament, the women's semifinal, I think. You can see the snow in the background. They are up on a platform, you can't quite see that, but you can see it looks a lot like a tennis court, and then there are the screens that are played off of. All right, so what about that for our use case? Well, the challenge with platform tennis tournaments, and there are pro players and pro tournaments, are that unlike a tennis tournament or a fencing tournament, where a lot of times you have one or maybe two locations and all play is centralized there, platform tennis, generally there's between 2 and 6 courts per location. So if you're running a tournament, you need multiple locations, and if you have multiple locations, there's a lot of logistics in making sure people go to the right place. So a lot of the communication has to support this. In 2011, the Nationals were in Chicago, and they're going to be in March again. We used 23 locations for the tournament, and approximately 140 volunteers who were helping with the players, taking scores, and doing a myriad of tasks. So another part of the challenge is that since with so many locations, when you start the match, you play a match, you don't necessarily where you're going to go next because your location is going to be determined by the outcome of your match. And the locations can be dispersed. Often the draws, especially for the larger tournaments, are pretty large, 128 teams for the men's and close to that for the women's. In addition to the main draw, there are as many as 8 back draws. So you may win your first match, lose your second match, go into a whole separate draw and play through that. You may lose your first match, go into a different draw, and usually you're guaranteed between 3 or 5 matches, and that's to support that. So that also makes it a little confusing. It's complicated enough that the American Platform Tennis Association put together this guide of how to read where you are and where you're supposed to go next. So in this case, on the very left, the person is playing at North Shore. They're C18, which is the Consolation, Dillman Smith. And if they win, they'll stay in this Consolation draw, but if they lose, they'll go over to that LC18 at the very right, and that's the last chance draw. So because of this, we need the scores to be reported to keep the tournament on track. And so the players can call in the scores, but they don't always do it because they're playing their match, they're trying to get to their next match, they're worried about other things. So we have volunteers that take the scores, and we'll try a number of things. We wondered if we had an app for the players that knew who they were, knew what match they had played, what they were playing next, and was easy enough to submit their scores. This could help the process. So we created this paddle score entry prototype. The first thing we need is a Restful service that's going to tell us when their next match is, who's it against. That's going to help with our first 2 challenges. And then on the client side, we need client applications for them to actually see the matches and enter their scores. So for the Restful service side of it, on the server side, the objective is to create a Restful service that returns the player's scheduled match information based on the input phone number. And for this prototype, we assumed that there was already a registration piece in process that would tie your phone to your tournament entry so that we would know who you were. So here we use the Restful controller annotation that was introduced in Spring 4. This tells Spring that every method in the controller should return a domain object instead of a view object. And it automatically converts these domain objects into the JSON format for you. So here's the paddle scores controller that we created. You can see it has that REST controller annotation. It has a request mapping for our get matches. We're going to take a parameter for the phone number. And then we have a simple method for the prototype that just basically returns the matches from the store based on the phone number. Okay, and so now our domain objects, we have the match object, which has the round number, the name of the draw, the main, the Consolation, reprieve, the match time, opposing team, location, winning team, and of course score, and anything else we need to do. And then we have our getters and setters, so that's easy enough. The matches contains the list of the matches and the phone number, and again, any pertinent information we'd want to keep about the team. And it's getters and setters. For deployment, we're going to use Spring Boot. It makes the configuration decisions so you don't have to. It takes all the jars that are on your class path, creates one big jar file for you so that then you can just manipulate that jar file, move it wherever you need to. You provide a main entry point so it knows where to start. And it configures a number of dependencies for you based on your class path. So it may embed Tomcat. There are a number of databases it can embed for you. Spring MVC. So anyway, it does a lot of that for you. Next slide. To use it, we add the dependency to our Gradle file and the plugin for Spring Boot. and we need to make the application an executable jar. To do this, we're going to create, which is essentially a boilerplate application class. It's going to use the enable auto configuration. That's what's telling it what to embed, the Tomcat or the Jetty. We're going to use a component scan, which registers your controllers. And then we're going to enter our entry point. And so here it is, application.java. It has the annotations we talked about. It's pretty straightforward, and it pretty much can be reused across projects. Next slide. And then we just simply, we build it. We take the jar, we copy it locally first and test it with our local browser. Once we're happy, we can copy it out to the cloud, and we can access it. And that was all pretty simple to deploy our thing. However, if you're working like Pete and I are with some other people, and we already have an existing cloud implementation that we're using that already has a Tomcat on port 8080, you could either change your configuration for the port, or there's also actually a way to pretty easily create the jar you just created. You change the build setting, and now you can have a WAR file that you just deploy like you would to any other Tomcat server. There's a good link that I included in the reference slides, but basically, you're going to create a Java class that substitutes for your web.xml since you don't have that. You extend the SpringBootServletInitializer class and override the configure method and any other configuration options that you want to override. You change your build to reflect that you want to use the WAR. And then you also tell Spring that you don't need it to embed Tomcat. You do that with the provided runtime and the dependency for Tomcat. And so here's what it looks like. We do a get from our browser. We see all our match information come back in JSON format with pretty limited coding. We also need a post scores so that they can submit their scores. To do that, we're going to do a very similar method in our controller. This time it'll be a post. We're going to take the round number, which is the number of the matches they've played, and then also in the body, we're going to, as a post parameter, we're going to have the match object, which will have the scores and the winning team and information about the match. Now we're going to, for the simulation, there's an update matches. It takes that information, and it's going to create your next match based on, presumably, the draw that was for the tournament, and return that to you. So the results for our RESTful service, we use the RESTful the REST controller in Spring Boot, and that made it pretty quick to develop our RESTful service. The source code was very straightforward. We have our controller. We have a couple of boilerplate files that we need to create, partly because of the Tomcat deployment. And then we have 2 domain objects, which we're going to bring up again later. OK, so that's it for the server side. Now we can go to the client-side apps. We're going to create iOS. We're going to use iOS 7 and Objective-C. And for Android, we'll use Java, and we'll use Spring for Android. So on the iOS side, there's a class called NSJSON serialization, which will parse the JSON into the dictionary object for you. You need to do your own processing for the request and response and the connection. But it's pretty straightforward. You get the response back, and then you call this NSJSON serialization, JSON object with data with your response object, and you'll get back this dictionary. From there, you can start extracting the values. For instance, for matches, we pull out our match list, and then for each match, we're going to pull out information like the opposing team, the scores, et cetera. And then you can just use it. So the get's pretty simple. There's not a whole lot of code there, but you do need to do your own processing. And the post is similar, but again, it will convert JSON to NS objects. But since our matches object is a custom object, we have to do a little more code just to extract, or just to convert our match object into an NS dictionary. So we create a 2 NS dictionary class in our match class. Next page. And it's pretty straightforward, right? Just setting the value for location. And then we're done. We were able to, again, without a whole lot of work, create that. You do need a little more code to handle the connection and convert the domain objects. But again, in terms of marshalling into a data format, it handles that for you pretty nicely. So now we go on to Android. And again, we were going to look at Spring for Android. All right, the stated objective of Spring for Android is to simplify development of native applications. Its core class is the REST template, which has the get and post methods we need, has message converters for a variety of different formats. We're going to use JSON, which is basically JSON format, but in a compressed style, which is good for the mobile side of this on the device. And if you're more interested in Spring for Android after this, there are a number of sample projects out there for various Twitter search client, et cetera. So here's a code sample for Android. We create our URL. We create a REST template. We add the converter we're interested in. In this case, it's the JSON HTTP message converter. And we call getForObject with our URL, with our class, and we get our matches back. And that's it. The matches come back. They're in the matches object. The JSON conversion's been done. They're in our domain objects. Now we can just go through and pull and do whatever we want to do in our app. In this case, we're just pulling the information, and we're going to create a real simple display. To use Spring for Android, you need to add it, add the dependency. We added the JSON dependency, and that was it. And here's the results. You can see the next team, the team name, and the phone number, and then next matches. So Spring for Android results, we were able to use it to rapidly create an app. And we were able to reuse that match and matches domain classes that we created back for the Restful service. Since this is Java 2, we can use them here. So now your server side and your client side are using the same business objects. If you add a field, you can recompile them both, and they'll both know about it without having to do that separately. If for some reason, perhaps on the back end, it's just a pass-through, now you're just adding it and recompiling, redeploying. A lot different than the old days back in our old prototyping days where we were communicating in different languages. So go add this to PHP, go add this over here to Java, go add this to Objective-C. Streamlines it. The next steps, I talked about the registration piece, adding push notifications to perhaps prompt the players to, you haven't entered your scores. Would you like to do that now? With the app, it allows us to save the information to the device so that if you're out of coverage, it could detect when you're back in coverage and wait till then to send off the scores. And obviously, an enhanced UI would be nice. So now we're going to do a demo, I hope. OK. This is my first match. In this case, we're going to pretend that we're all a team by the name of Clark Addison. And our first match is going to be on Friday a.m. at 9 o'clock at Winnetka, the 2-letter codes for the location, versus Smith Jones. So now we've played that match, and we want to enter our scores. There we go. And so it comes up. It came with the matches that it knows about for us. And it says, oh, yeah, 9 o'clock, who won? You played against Smith Jones. And we can say, oh, we won this match. So that's good. And our scores were 262. We submit the scores back to the Restful service and post them back to our store. And it shows that our next match is now at 10 o'clock versus Walters and Carter. All right, so Clark and Addison still have a little time before their next match. So they're going to go over And they're going to watch another point being played just to see how paddle works. So this is for the top 10 players. This is just one point. One of the things you can get a feel for is that with the screens, you can't really overpower or hit a winner, because at the top levels here, they can pretty much get anything back. So it's a lot of patience and trying a lot of different shots and trying to not to make errors. So you see our shot count is 37 now, and this is the name of this video is an above average paddle point. This is above average, but they'll go into the hundreds in some of the shots. Not this one. And then you don't want to be that guy, right? All right, so Clark and Addison finished their watching that shot, and now they went on and played their next match. And so we're ready for them to enter their next score. And unfortunately, they lost. So what's going to happen here is, since they lost, you're going to notice that now they're out of the main draw. We're going to submit scores. And when we go back, they're playing at 11 at Glenview versus Bradford Johnson, but now they're in the consolation draw up here. And so they win that. And they win their next match, and they've won the consolation. So they're done there. And let's see what our Android app thinks. And the Android app comes back with the same information. Obviously, there's a little problem with the simulation because the Android phone and the iPhone wouldn't have the same phone number, but we're going to do that for purposes just to show that the same call to the Restful controller that we did back in step 1 now carries across. And of course, if you want to look on your web browser, you can also call it from there. So sorry. Okay, so we were able to use Spring, Android, Spring Boot, and the Spring framework to help us with that mobile demo. But out there is another Spring project called Spring Mobile, and we want to look at that as well. So what does Spring Mobile give us? Well, actually, it gives us device detection, view resolvers, and site preference. The site preference and view resolution is something that Pete and I dealt with a lot at the bank back when we were doing what we called WMobile. And the idea was that depending on if a tablet or a phone or a browser was hitting your device, you wanted to show a different display, right? You wanted to have custom views for each one. But with the advent in the last couple of years of responsive web, I think a lot of people have turned from taking that approach and now use mostly responsive web. If you look at your Spring Mobile schedule on your phone, that's a responsive web app, and it uses the grid system, which is a lot easier. So not as interested in that, but the device detection is still very pertinent today because of the metrics it allows you to gather as a business. So you want to know if your site's being hit by a tablet or by a phone, and how many, because that can make you make decisions based on that as to what to invest in terms of development. So Spring Mobile comes with this device resolver class, configures a default one for you, and that is using a detection algorithm that's part of the WordPress mobile pack. You can override that configuration if you don't want to use it. And also it has a configuration mechanism to override individual things as well. So the thing about device detection is that there's no standard user agent. User agent is the request header that you're most likely going to examine to determine if something's mobile or a tablet or a desktop or what have you. And unfortunately, of all the manufacturers, there's no real standard. So the user agent may incorrectly identify a device. New devices are coming out, as you know, continuously. And so knowing what those are and tracking them becomes complicated. So one thing that can help with this, though, is if you have an application that you can run that from any device that can tell you, yes, we detected this as a mobile, and here's the criteria we use to detect this. Here's your user agent, here's any other relevant HTTP headers. So what we did for this was we created what we're calling a Snoop application. And it looks like we're using a Snoop controller. We use a Spring Mobile device injected. And that allows us to say, is it normal, is it mobile, is it a tablet? And then we just add a request header for the user agent, and presumably you'd want to add more. But we add that, and we deploy this to the cloud, run it from our phone again, run it from your tablet, and let's see what kind of results we get. All right, so from the MacBook, the device type was normal. And you can see part of the user agent that came through. From the iPhone 5, the device type was mobile, which is good. And there's the user agent it did. But like I said, they're continuously adding devices. So you may end up having to, say, have a device type of watch. So we were able to use the Spring for Mobile to rapidly create a troubleshooting app. Again, we had the application.java that we saw earlier, and then just that Snoop controller, which was just a few lines of code. So to recap, prototyping with Spring actually did help us a lot. There was a lot of code that we saved, and it's actually very simple to create a lot of this stuff with the various Spring projects. And now I'm going to turn it back to Pete for closing comments.
Thanks, Ann. So I know I had some closing comments here somewhere. So there's a lot of catalysts now to enable creativity. Lots of client-side tools, Spring Boot on the server side. And these have removed a lot of barriers that used to exist for mobile development. Going way back, you had to run your application through the carrier before you could even run it on your device. Now, anybody with anybody with $0 can go ahead and use an emulator. For $99, you can put apps on your iPhone, try them out for yourself, and you don't have to check with anybody to do that. So all you really need is good ideas. One thing about good ideas is there's also a timing aspect. You can have a good idea, but you can have it 2 years too early and think that nobody cares about it, forget about it, and then somebody else goes in and does something that you thought of first. Not that that's ever happened to me. I hope I don't sound bitter. But if you have a good idea, hang in there and nurse it along, and then watch for the opportunity to present itself. So that's pretty much all we got. We got time for questions, and you can ask anything you want about Spring Boot, about mobile prototyping. Can you go to the next with our contact information? Oh. yeah, we want to talk about this. We're not the only talk on mobile. So here's some other great mobile talks. If you have interest, go ahead and attend these. Ann and I will probably attend these ourselves. And then we should have our contact information up here. I keep on talking about contact information, and we have other slides.
So here's some references based on what we did. If you're interested, and that'll be in the slide. If you're interested in Paddle, the American Platform Tennis Association link.
So I am absolutely passionate about mobile. So if you got any questions on mobile that you don't want to ask here, there's my email. Go ahead and reach out to me, and I would love to hear even what your thoughts are on mobile. So is there any questions you guys have? Please. Got to talk real loud.
You say that it's for providing you use technologies. What would you use if you wanted to go into production?
So the question is, so I'm gonna ask it this way. Do you use one set of tools for prototyping and one set of tools for production? I'm sorry? Yeah, no, I think I get your question. So for the client side, for mobile banking, we intentionally, in fact, we actually mocked and ridiculed groups that used wireframes, because the wireframes that they presented to the business probably wouldn't match up with what they actually plan to do. But some teams, and this is less common now, but there used to be teams that did the wireframes, and then they would do that, and then they turn over to the development team. The development team would be like, we can't do that. So we were kind of a unique team in that we were soup to nuts from, we were an emerging technology team, but we intentionally always did all of our prototyping with the tools that we would roll into production. So in the case of the client side and the client servicing code running on the server side, that was using, and that code actually went right into production after it went through all the testing and everything. We did mimic some bank, some customer operations, which we were not changing using things like the PHP and things like that. But that stuff was never going. So I am a strong proponent of prototyping with the tools that you plan to put in production for the reasons that you raised. So we're like-minded on that, I would say. Great question, though. Thank you. Other questions? I know if you wait 8 seconds, most North Americans get very anxious if there's silence for that long. So, come on, one more question. Walt, how about you? You got nothing? Okay, well, if you have any questions, I'll be around after the talk. Ann will be around after the talk. And please send me an email, even with your own mobile experiences. And oh, you have a question. Good. He's asking if with Spring Boot, do you get good horizontal scaling? Was that your question? Ann, you want to take that one?
You know, I think I'm going to defer that to I know there are a couple of big Spring Boot talks coming up tomorrow, and I think I would go for that. Certainly, we were using this on a smaller scale, but it didn't. You know, ultimately, you have this jar and you're deploying it. I think it should work fine.
Okay.
So I think the same question, why we're asking, and I don't know much about the Spring Boot, but would that be something you will use in the production environment ever?
Actually, we use it in production environment. I don't feel any difference between Spring 4 and Spring Boot, except that the low-level configurations that you are doing is done by Spring Boot for you. So it's kind of an opinionated framework, right? So when you say, I want to use a REST API, you just say that, Spring Boot start a REST, and it knows that it brings you Jackson, log4j and all those kind of things where you have to do the low-level requiring. And in this case, you won't be doing that because it's got its opinion. But instead, if you want to use JSON, you just say, hey, I don't like your opinion, I got my own. So you say, override it with JSON. And then it knows that, okay, your opinion is to use JSON and it overrides Jackson with JSON.
Right, so the question is that if you go to production, there will be way much configuration. So is it better sometimes, I would think that sometimes it might be better just to do all the configuration using the Spring 4 versus Spring Boot, because then you'll be pretty much configuring everything.
Why would you be configuring everything in production? You know when you're doing a REST API, you need certain things, right? Those are what like Spring gives you, like, as defaults. If you don't like them, you can override them. One thing I'll agree is, like, you might get some extra jars in your application, which might make it a little bit more packed. But apart from that, I think like going with Spring 4 or Spring Boot, doesn't make any difference in production.
Are you worried about existing, like we had the existing Tomcat scenario? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, something like that, what you mentioned.
Right. So I think it would depend on how much of your environment is already existing that you need to get around and how much you're going to have to change. But if, I think then you'd have to weigh how much is already out there that you're going to need to reconfigure in the Spring Boot. And you should really examine your class path to make sure there's not extraneous stuff on it, right? Because otherwise you're going to get some.
One more thing I'm curious about is Spring. Can you start with Spring Boot and then go with the traditional Spring 4 application in the sense that you let Spring Boot to do the original thing for you and then go back and do the configuration in a traditional way? Or that might be a very basic question, but I don't know much about Spring Boot.
So I don't think that works out, right? You're doing double work now. You have two apps that you have to configure. So, I don't think this is the topic for talking about Spring Boot as such, I guess, but it's like, you have a directory where all your property files go. Like, Spring Boot says, like, all your application properties go in a particular folder. If you don't like that, if you don't like what Spring is providing as its opinion, then maybe you're better off doing like Spring 4.
Thank you.